Today's daf is Chulin daf Membeis, and we are at the beginning of the third perek of Masechtas Chulin, perek Elu Treifos, on the top of daf Membeis Amud Aleph. So the third perek of Masechtas Chulin, perek Elu Treifos, is a very large Masechta. It's a large perek. It's actually the size of a small Masechta, and as its name implies, it deals primarily with the halachos of treifos. So what exactly is a treifa? There's one pasuk in the Torah that addresses this. The pasuk's tucked away. It's in Parshas Mishpatim. So after you have the halachas of Eved Ivri and Am Ivriya, you have the halachas of the Arba Avos Nezikin, the halachas of the Shoimrim, says the Torah, Va'anshe kodesh tiyun li, ubasar basada treifa loisei chelu, la'kelev tashlichu noisei. Literally, if you find one of your animals in the field, it was clawed, it was torn apart by a larger animal, the halacha is loisei chelu. You're not allowed to eat it. Rather, what are you supposed to do with it? You're supposed to throw it to the dogs. Now, this pasuk is describing an animal that's alive. If the animal's dead and it died because some larger animal tore it apart, it would be an avela. And the Torah says elsewhere that an avela is something that's asur b'achila. That's Chulin 101. So clearly what we're talking about is an animal that's alive. It was torn, quote unquote. It's a treifa, but at the same time, the animal's still alive. Says the Torah that being that it's in a state of treifa right now, that in and of itself says that if you do a shechita later, the shechita does not have the ability to permit the meat of this animal to be eaten. So what's unique about a treifa? Chazal said, what's unique about a treifa is that the animal right now, being that it's in this state, has a defect that is going to cause it at some point to die. And from here, we have a halacha l'Moshe Sinai that says that even though the Torah said the halacha of treifa in one very precise, particular instance, but tein lo chacham v'yech gamoid, that any time an animal has a defect, a mortal defect, something that's going to cause the animal to die, the halacha is that it's deemed a treifa, and if somebody eats from it, he's over the loisase in the Torah of ubasar basada treifa loisay chelo. And the halacha l'Moshe Sinai went on to list, as we'll see in today's daf already, 18 examples of treifas, 18 defects, 18 wounds, 18 medical issues that this animal has, as a result of which we deem this animal to be a treifa. If somebody eats from it, he's going to be over the Isser treifa. The Rambam says that even though there's a brisa that says Yudches treifas, but the Yudches treifas are to Perek Elu treifas, like the Arba Avos Nezikin are to Masechtas Bava Kama, or like the Lamed Tes Malachas are to Hilchas Shabbos. And that is the 18 treifas are 18 of ha-treifos. So you have avos nezikin, you have av malachos, but avos b'chlal de'ekatoldos. So it's true they're yudches treifos, but really there are many, many subcategories. There are many toldos to these yudches treifos. In fact, the Rambam did the math for us, and the Rambam said, I counted all the treifos that are listed in Perek Elu treifos, and the grand total is 70. Says the Rambam, Nimtzu, kol ha-treifos ha-menuyos. If you count up all the treifos, kishayifritu, ve'efsher sheyimtzu b'behema v'chaya, shivim. And then the Rambam lists literally from 1 through 70. This is the end of Perek Yud and Hilchas Shchita. He gives you all 70 treifos. So in other words, although the Torah said that the halacha of treifa relates to something very specific, ubasar basada treifa loisei cheilu, says the halacha l'Moshe Sinai that one mentioned in the Torah is lav dafka. Rather, you have Yudches treifos or 70 treifos. We'll see in the Gemara, different Amiram had different lists and different numbers. The bottom line is, it's lav dafku basa basada treifa loisei cheilu. Stating that, the Rambam does say that being that the Torah mentioned one specific treifa in the Torah, and the other ones are known miter shebal peh from halacha l'Moshe Sinai, it suggests that there must be something more chamor with the one treifa that's mentioned in the Torah. It plays itself out with regards to the halachas of sveikos. If you have a suffix in a treifa, so when it comes to a suffix of ubasar basada treifa loisei chelu, the literal treifa that's mentioned in the Torah, you'd have to be noyig one way. As it relates to a suffix with regards to the other treifas, you'd be able to be noyig a different way. More about that as in the coming dafim. Now, there's a very important machlokes that underpins the entire Perek Elu treifas, and that is treifa chaya or a treifa and eina chaya. So if you ask the man on the street, what's the definition of a treifa? Whether it's a treifa of a behema or if it's a treifa loyalena with a human being, so he's going to say someone's dealing with a medical condition, a very precise medical condition, as a result of which the doctors or the veterinarian said that this person or this animal cannot live yud beis chaydish. That's the conventional definition of a treifa. And the truth is, that is the halacha. But it's only one shita in the Gemara. The Gemara, and we'll see it right away in the beginning of the parak, brings another mandamar that says treifa chaya. So the mandamar that says treifa eino chaya, that means as a result of this defect, person or animal cannot live yud beis chaydish. What about the mandama that says treifa chaya? So again, you ask the man on the street, he's going to say, I don't know, maybe the person could be ma'arich yom v'shonim, the animal could live till it's 120 years old. But the truth is, it's a very, very big mistake. Even the mandama that says that treifa chaya agrees that this defect that the animal has right now is going to cause the animal to die. If the defect is not going to cause the animal to die, the animal or the person cannot be deemed a treifa. The shaila treifa chaya, treifa eina chaya is whether or not the treifa is going to die within yud beis chaydish or not going to die within yud beis chaydish. The mandama that says treifa eina chaya means eina chaya yud beis chaydish. The mandama that says treifa chaya says more than Yud Beis Chodesh. There's a lashon in the Rishonim later, 2 years, 3 years. But the point is that at some point this animal's going to die. If the doctors say that as far as we're concerned, the prognosis is wonderful and it's just a little bit of an issue, take these meds and the animal can live forever, then it wouldn't be a treifa. So a treifa, everybody agrees, is a mortal defect. The question is, treifa eina chaya, it's going to die imminently within Yud Beis Chodesh, or is the point of treifa that lav dafka, it's going to die imminently, it's chaya, but for sure at some point it's going to have to die. Another thing worth mentioning is that ordinarily you'd think that the reason a treifa is asa b'achila is because you're not allowed to eat an animal that's about to die. But it's a mistake. We just learned the sugya on Daf Lamed Zayin, where the Gemara talks about a behema misukenes. And a behema misukenes, even though Yecheskel Hanavi was machmer, and even though it's brought down in Shulchan Aruch that the Gedolei HaChasidim throughout the generations used to be machmer when it came to the behema misukenes, but mi'ikar adin, a behema misukenes is mutter, which means that if you have an animal that's on its deathbed, it's a geisus, it's about to die, and you shech the animal, as long as it's mefarches at the time of the shechita, machlekes tanah, what exactly that means, but if it shows some sign of vitality throughout the shechita, that would be enough for it to be a kosher shechita, which means there's nothing wrong with eating from an animal that's about to die. The issue is not that it's about to die. That's not the punchline. The punchline is that it has a mortal defect. That's the point. That there's something very specific, a specific illness, a puncture in one of its vital organs, as we're going to see, that's causing it to die. The fact that it's einei chaya is the praba, that it's the kind of wound that deems the animal a treifa. But the emphasis is not the fact that it's about to die. Even if you hold treifa eina chaya. The emphasis is the fact that it has a particular wound. Once it has this wound, it's called a treifa, and the Torah says, "Ubasa b'sada treifa loy soy chevo." Just to begin the parak with a dvar agada, and that is, so what are you supposed to do with the treifa? So you throw it in the garbage? Torah says no. It says in the Torah, like kelev tashlicha noisei. And Rashi says this isn't just a suggestion. It isn't just a recommendation that you're not sure what to do, so we'll give you a few practical options like this. You know how to deal with your treifas. No, the Torah very specifically wants you to go and to give it to the kelev, and the reason is v'limedcha kosev she'ena kadosh baruch hu mekapeach schar kol beria. She'nemar, this is in Yonah D'Yovel l'chol b'nei Yisrael lo yechratz kelev l'shoynoi. When the Yidden left Mitzrayim, so the dogs they showed respect to the Yidden. That at the very least they were lo yechratz kelev l'shoynoi. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, "Tenu lo yischaroi." Now's the time to reward the dogs for what they did. So this treifa that you're not sure what to do with, la kelev tashlicha. In fact, la kelev tashlicha is such a direct tzivah the Torah. I saw the Minchas Chinuch, a mitzvah ayin gimels bothered. How come the Moinei HaMitzvahs didn't count it as a mitzvah? Right? None of the Moinei HaMitzvahs, one of the 613 mitzvahs, are take the treifa and give it to the kelev. Frank the Minchas Chinuch, I don't know why. It says in the Torah, la kelev tashlicha. To me, it sounds like a mitzvah like any other mitzvah in the Torah. It's not just a suggestion. Ayin Rashi. So l'chur, if this is what you're supposed to do with it, so why didn't the Moinei HaMitzvah count it as a mitzvah? But either way, it says the Torah la kelev tashlicha. The Ibn Ezra on this pasuk says that if you know diktuk, you should be bothered why the Torah said la kelev with a pasach tashlichanoisai as opposed to likelev with a shva tashlichanoisai. Likelev tashlichanoisai. What does la kelev tashlichanoisai mean? Says the Ibn Ezra, you know what it means? Back in the day when people had a herd of animals, the shepherd always had a dog, and the dog's job was to protect the animals against attackers, to make sure that a wolf or a lion or some dangerous animal wasn't going to come and tear these animals apart. So the Torah says that if you go now to your field and you find one of your animals was torn apart, you have a treifa, don't just find any random dog and give it to it. The mitzvah is not likelev, which would suggest any dog, but la kelev. You should give it to the dog with the, hey, how you do, so to speak. The dog who is responsible for watching this herd, this is the dog that you're supposed to give it to. Rabbi Aaron Gruman of Torah Links, hashtag Lakewood Fellowships, once showed me a beautiful daskein in Bali Tosfos. It's right here on this pasuk. He says something unbelievable. He says, when it comes to Hakaras HaTov, most people have the idea of, what have you done for me lately, right? So if somebody did you a taiva, you'll be makir taiv. But this same person could have been really nice, done tremendous amount of chasadim for 20 years. But if he crossed you the wrong way in the last 5 minutes, you're going to have a whole different perspective on it. Says the Das Kein Bali Tosfos that this is a very important lesson when it comes to Kafui Taiv. You know why? Because think about it. This dog is the reason that your animal was just torn apart. You had an animal, you were waiting to shecht it, it's worth a lot of money. You come to the field, now you're not allowed to eat it. What happened? Someone didn't do his job. Who is that? It's the dog. Says the Torah. You know what you're supposed to do with the animal? Like kelev tashlichanoisai. To the dog? Yeah. You know why, says the Das Kenim? To be makir toiv. And even though your inclination might be the opposite, I'm going to be makir toiv now? This dog, that's the reason that I just had this unbelievable financial loss. I'm going to go ahead and give my treifa to this dog. The answer is yes. Because even though right now maybe he didn't have a good day, but he has been your loyal, trusted dog for so long. And as a result, be makatoi for what he did for you. Not what have you done for me lately, and as a result, I'm going to punish the dog. To the contrary, now's the time to show the dog that you appreciate what the dog did for you, despite the fact that right now he caused you tremendous financial loss. Either way, on that note, a classic parak. Zok the Mishnah, Elu treifos bebehema. The following are a list of treifos, of defects that would render an animal treifa. Now, it's very clear. The Mishnah is talking about treifas bebehema, and we're going to have a very long list of treifas. There's another Mishnah, Daf Vavam and Aleph, that discusses treifas ba'if. Either way, treifas specifically bebehema. Number one, nikuvas haveshet. If the esophagus, the veshet of the behema, has a nekev, it has a hole, it has a puncture, that renders it a treifa. Very important Rashi. First Rashi in the parak, kol nekev b'mashu. Anytime you find the word nekev in parak elu treifas, it means a tiny little puncture. Even if it's a mashu, that would be enough to render it a treifa. Upsukas hagargeres. Or if the kana, the trachea, was severed. And this is something we know already from learning the first two prakim of Masechtas Chulin, that how a veshet becomes a treifa versus how the kana becomes a treifa is very different. The veshet, any little puncture, makes it a treifa. When it comes to the gargeres, chatzi kana pagum is still kosher. Right? If half of the kana was severed by a thorn or by anything, it's still going to be kosher. It's only if the majority of the kana, majority of the width, Rashi says, was severed, that it becomes a treifa. So when it comes to the veshet, it's nikuvas haveshet. Even a nekev in the veshet makes it a treifa. When it comes to the gargeres, which is the kana, it has to be psukas hagargeres. A nekev in and of itself will not make it a treifa, but it has to be a psuka. Psuka means the majority of it was severed. Nikev krum shel moyach. If the membrane that surrounds the brain of the behemoth was punctured, again, nikev, even if it's a kol shehu, that would be enough for it to be a treifa. Nikev halev the beis chalali. Or if the heart was punctured and the puncture went into the chamber of the heart. Nishbara hashedra, if the neck bone of the animal was cracked. V'nifsach hachutchala, and the spinal cord was torn. Rashi says that nishbara hashedra is not really important. What matters is nifsach hachutchala. We're focusing on the spinal cord. We're not focusing on the neck bone. Rashi says ordinarily, if the spinal cord is torn, it would mean mean that the neck bone was broken. But it's not nishbara hashedra that renders the animal a treifa. It's nifsak achutshela that renders it a treifa. Nitel hakaved, if the liver of the animal was removed, and there's nothing remaining up. We'll see more about that in tomorrow's stuff. Hareya shenikva, the lungs that were punctured, or part of the lungs are missing. Reb Shimon says it's not enough for the puncture to just touch the lungs, but rather we're going to see later in the Gemaras that there's bronchi that's attached to the lungs. We don't have to know what that means for now. And according to Reb Shimon, if the nekev goes into the symphonos, then it's a problem. But if it's merely touching the lungs, then it's not a problem. Nikva, hakeva. So an animal, and this is important, has 4 stomachs: the keres, the beis hakoisos, the hemses, and the keva. So if the keva, which is the 4th stomach, if you're counting, so the keva, if it has a nekev, that would make it into a treifa. Nikva hamor, if the gallbladder has a nekev, that would make it a treifa. Nikvu hadakin, if the intestines have a nekev, that would make it into a treifa. Hakeres haprimis, what about the keres? That's one of the other 4 stomachs. So if it's the keres haprimis, we'll see what that means in the Gemara. Shenikva, that has a nekev of a mashu, or if it's not the keres hapnimis, but rather it's the keres hachitzoyna. Over there, nikfa won't make it a treifa, but it has to be nikra ruba. The majority of it has to be torn. Rabbi Yehuda says that if it's the keres hachitzoyna, then the sheer treifa is not nikra roiv, but rather it depends on the size of the animal. Hagdoil, if it's a bigger animal, tefach. Vaktan, if it's a smaller animal, beruba, then the halacha is going to be roiv. Hemseis ubeis hakoises. Those are the other 2 of the 4 stomachs. So we had the keva, the keres, now we have the hemsis and the beis hakoises. Shenikfu, so they're lumped together as one. If there's a whole lachutz on the outer wall, it's going to be a treifa. If it's on the inner wall is where the hemses and the beis hakoises are attached. So if that wall has an ektiv, it doesn't make it a treifa. It's only if it's the outer wall that has the puncture that it's a treifa. Naflam and agag, if an animal falls off a roof, the halach is it's a treifa. Rashi says that there's a whole halacha. The Gemara is going to discuss it in the coming dafin of how you treat an animal that falls off the roof. You have to wait me'es leis. You have to wait 24 hours. You have to make sure that this animal lives to tell the story. If it survives me'es leis, then it's going to be okay. If it was shachta miyad, if you shechted it immediately, that's when it's going to be a problem. If the majority of the ribs of the animal broke, it's a treifa. Drusas hazev, that's ubasa basada treifa loisachero. If it was clawed by a ze'ev, the halacha is it's too going to be a treifa. Rabbi Yehuda says drusas haze'ev bedaka. A ze'ev, a wolf, can make a behema daka into a treifa, but it can't make a behema gasa, a larger animal, into a treifa. What kind of animal would have to claw the animal when the animal's a behema gasa in order to make it a treifa? It's drusas ariba gasa. It would have to be something like a lion. Drusas haneitz ba'oif. A small bird can make an oif into a drusa. If it's an oif hadak, if it's a bigger bird, then it would have to be clawed by a bigger bird. This is the rule as it relates to treifas, and this is really the punchline. The definition of treifas, says the Mishnah, is any animal that has a defect, as a result of which the animal will not be able to live. The Gemara is going to say that the Tana of the Mishnah holds behema ein chaya, which means that the taich of the last line of the Mishnah, in light of the introduction, is zehaklal kol she'en kamaya chaya. Any animal that has a defect, as a result of which it can't live Yud Beis Chodesh, it would make it into a treifa. Where's the remez in the Torah to the concept of a treifa? It's a passing in the Torah. No, I know where it says in the Torah treifa. However, the Tana of this Mishnah clearly holds that treifa ain't a chaya. That was the last line of the Mishnah. Zehakal kol she'in kamaya chaya treifa. So Rish Lakish wanted to know, where is there a remez in the Torah that a treifa is ain't a chaya? The pasuk that says "Ubasa basada treifa loisachelu" doesn't say anything about a mortal defect, a defect where the animal just needs to rehab for a couple of weeks and then is going to be fine. It's not clear in the pasuk of "Ubasa basada treifa loisachelu" what exactly we're talking about. And we have this very, very important machlokes with 2 very strong-minded positions on the 2 sides. Treifa chaya, treifa ain't a chaya. So Rish Lakish said, where is this even coming from? I read the pasuk. The pasuk doesn't have any giloi as to treifa chaya ain't a chaya. So Rish Lakish wanted to know the man dama that holds treifa ain't a chaya, which is the time of our Mishnah. Zeh klal kol shein kamoy chaya. treifa. So where does he see that? So the Gemara says, the Tani Seifa, Zakol Koshen Chai treifa, Michal the treifa, and Chai Minolon. So the Gemara says, the Chsev, Zois Achaya Asher Toichlo. We had this pasuk in the Sugya Misukenes, in the previous parak. The pasuk, when it talks about animals that are kosher, that you're allowed to eat, it says, V'zois Hachaya Asher Toichlu. And we darshan chaya as in an animal, but also chaya miloshin chayim. Chaya, an animal that can live a chayil, she'ena chaya, lo yiseichel. So we have this general pasuk that seems to say that an animal that doesn't have the ability to live, you're not allowed to eat. Says Rish Lakish, presumably the Manda Amar that holds treifa ena chaya held that this pasuk is a reference to a treifa. Now, the fact that you're not allowed to eat a treifa is a mefurish pasuk. Ubasa basada treifa lo yisachelu. But it's a little unclear what that pasuk means. So Rish Lakish says the man that holds treifa in chaya used that pasuk of v'zois chaya asher toichelu as a revelation, as a gilui in how to understand the pasuk ubasa basada treifa lo yisachelu. In that pasuk, you see there's an idea of chaya echol, an animal that can live, you're allowed to eat in a chaya lo yisachel. Presumably, it's explaining the pasuk of treifa. If that's the case, Michal the treifa lo yisachel. You see from there that a treifa is not able to live. What about the man that knows that a treifa could live? Again, what does it mean he could live? Not he's going to live forever, but he could live beyond the Yud Beis Chaydish. Nafkalei mizois hachaya asher toichlu, and we learn from here zois hachaya echol. The emphasis on zois chaya acheres lo yisechel. However, there's another type of chaya, an animal that can live that you're not allowed to eat. What's this other animal that could live that you're not allowed to eat? Again, it's very sus on the pasuk. So the man that holds a treifa chai says, oh, it's probably referring to treifa. And if that's the case, you see from here that a treifa could live because zois hachaya, this animal that could live, you're allowed to eat. Other animals that can live, you're not allowed to eat, referring to treifa. Again, how do you know? Because we have this pasuk that we don't really know what it means. So presumably this is coming to mefarish that pasuk, and if that's the case, we're describing a treifa as an animal that can live. Thus, you have the source to the mandama that says that chaya can't, that a treifa is chaya. So both the manda amar that holds treifa ain't a chaya, and the manda amar that holds treifa chaya learn it from the same pasuk. It says v'sois hachaya asher toichlu. The manda amar that says treifa ain't a chaya says only a chaya toichlu. She'ena chaya loy toichlu. The treif is an ena chaya. The man that says that a treif is chaya, he says zois chaya. This animal that can live toichlu, but there's another animal that's a chaya that can live. Where the halach is, you're not allowed to. He says the man that holds treif ena chaya. What does it do with the word zois? Now the literal meaning of that pasuk zois chaya asher toichlu. Again, we went through this a few days ago, but the literal meaning of that pasuk is not talking about treifa, right? It's talking about kosher animals. These animals are kosher, these animals are not kosher. So it says the Gemara, the man Amar that doesn't use zois to teach me that a treifa is chaya is going to use the word zois in the more literal context of the pasuk, and it's coming to teach me that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu taught Moshe Rabbeinu which animals are kosher, which animals were not kosher, HaKadosh Baruch Hu literally, Tafas HaKadosh Baruch Hu mikol min v'min. Hashem brought animals in front of Moshe. V'hera loy l'Moshe. V'amalei zois echol, v'zois loy toichal. That's what the zois is. Zois is always referring to, right? You were pointing to HaChodesh Hazeh. Malamit Hera HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Moshe already showed him that when the moiled looks like this is when you're supposed to be Mekadesh l'Chodesh. So here too, zois is Hashem pointed to the animals, but it's in the context of the literal meaning of the pasuk, not in the context of the laws of treifa. So l'chura, the mandama that holds that a treifa is chaya, how could he learn it from the word zois? Doesn't he too use the word zois to teach me that a Kadosh Baruch Hu was tafas mikol min v'min v'hera loy l'Moshe? Says the Gemara, ein hachinami. You're right. Elo treifa chaya minole. So the mandama that holds treifa chaya, how does he know treifa chaya? We thought he learned it from the word zois. This animal that can live, you're allowed to eat. There are other animals that can live, that you cannot eat, referring to the treifa. Thus you see a treifa is chaya. But if Zois is coming to teach me something completely different, how does he know that a treifa is chaya? So the Gemara says, Nafkalei mi'idach tana devei Rabbi Yishmael. He learns it from a different brisa, also, by the way, from tana devei Rabbi Yishmael. This is a very important brisa. The tana devei Rabbi Yishmael, bein hachaya hanecheles, ubein hachaya asher loy soicha. So this is a different pasuk. Lahavdu ben atame ben atar, ubein hachaya hanecheles, ubein hachaya asher loy soicha. So you see in the Torah that there's a concept of a chaya which means an animal that can live, that you're not allowed to eat. And what did Tanav Rabbi Shmuel say? What is it referring to? This is referring to the Yud Ches Treifos, the 18 Treifos that was said to Moshe Rabbeinu Mi Sinai. The point is, however, that not the emphasis on the 18, that will be the topic of the rest of the daf. But for right now, before we exhale for a second, so you see from here is that how are we referring to the treifa as a chaya asher lo yisayach? Oh, referring to it as a chaya asher lo yisayachel. So you see clearly that a treifa is chaya. The bottom line is that the first Gemara in Perek Elu Treifas deals with this very fundamental shaila, which will come up again, and that is treifa chaya or treifa ein chaya. The man that holds treifa chaya holds that it's true there is a defect that's going to cause the animal to die, but it's not imminent. It's chaya. It can live more than yud beis chodesh. The man that holds that treifa ein chaya holds that no, the mitzias is that it's not going to be able to live yud beis chodesh. The question is, what's the nafka mina lahalacha? Whether a treifa is chaya or a treifa is ein chai. So you'll tell me, what do you mean? Maybe the nafkamina is very simple. The nafkamina would be, what happens if something changes? What happens if one of the Yud Ches treifas, or one of the 70 treifas, we find out at some later date, maybe because of medical intervention, it allows this animal to live Yosem Yud Beis Chodesh. I mean, what would be if you had one of the treifas, Shemanu Chazal, and 3,000 years later, medical technology has advanced tremendously for human beings, for animals as well. There's certain interventions, there's certain things that we can now do to a wounded animal or to an animal that's suffering from a medical condition, and as a result of that, the animal's going to be able to live. So the animal has a nekev in its reya, in its lungs. We could do a surgery, we can perform some sort of procedure that's going to allow the animal to live. So, yesh lachkar, should the animal still be considered a treifa, or should the animal not be considered a treifa? So the truth is, the Rambam addresses this in the end of Perek Yud of Hilchos Shchita. Says the Rambam, very important Rambam. And it's important because, as we're going to see, there's a lot of very interesting halacha l'maisa treifa shaylas, kosher versus glak kosher. It goes very much into the whole idea of a chalav stam. Right? There's a huge treifa component to the chalav stam situation. So either way, the Rambam says as follows: the ein lahoisav al treifa zeilu klal. That I just listed 18, and then I listed 70. You're not allowed to be moisef on the treifa. Shekol sheyer lo behema lechaya oy lo oif chutz mi elu shemanu chach mi hadaris harishonim. If any animal, doesn't matter, it's a behema chaya oif, that would have a quote unquote treifa, but it's not one of the aforementioned. It's not one of the 70. So the halacha is we have to assume that it could be this animal is going to live. We paskin treifa ein chai. So we could assume that maybe it's going to live, and as a result, it's not a treifa. Then the Rambam says, "Va'afilu noida lanu miderech harafua she'ein tzayfa lichyos." We don't go based on what we see right now. Meaning, what would be if a new nekev or something that the chachamim weren't minor? We know today that if an animal gets this, it's dead. So l'chayra, we paskin treifa eino chaya, even though the chachamim didn't list it. You would think in Svara that it should be considered one of the treifas. Says the Rambam, no. The ein lahoisef al treifos eluka. That's Perek Yud Halach Yud Beis. Then Perek Yud Gimel, that's the flip side of the coin. V'chein elu shemanu v'amru shehein treifa afal pi sheyirim midarkei harefua shebiyodenu shemiktsasan ein mamisen ve'efshe shetichi mehen. Even if the Metzias changes, and we find now that the animal could live, ein lecha ela ma shemanu chacham. The halacha is that it doesn't change anything. Meaning, we still view it as a treifa, shenemar al pi ha-Torah asher yerucha. So says the Rambam, we know nishtana hametzios. And if that's the case, how does that impact the laws of treifa? Says the Rambam, it doesn't. So anything that the Chachamim listed as a treifa is a treifa. Anything that they didn't list as a treifa is not a treifa. And it goes both ways. There's two sides to this coin. Number one, if the Chachamim didn't list something as a treifa, and we know today that something is a treifa, it doesn't matter. It's not going to be counted as a treifa. The flip side, if the Chachamim did list something as a treifa, and because of advanced medical technology, the treifa is no longer a treifa, doesn't matter, says the Rambam. It's still going to be viewed as a treifa. So the truth is that if you have an animal that has a nekev and it can live more than Yud Beis Chodesh, that's neither here nor there. You can't say, oh, we paskin treifa ein chai. And now that we know that an animal can live more than Yud Beis Chodesh with a nekev in the reya or whatever it is, so that's a raya that it's not a treifa. That's not true. Because at the end of the day, what's going to govern Hilchas Treifas are the Mishnayos and the Brises and the Gemaras that we're about to learn. Whatever the Chachamim were Moina, that's a Treifa. Whatever the Chachamim weren't Moina is not a Treifa. There's a Baal Tosef, there's a Baal Tigra. You're not allowed to play and manipulate the Treifas as a result of the fact that things have changed. So again, what's the difference then if a Treifa is Chaya or if a Treifa is Ein Chaya? Say the Rishonim, there's a very important nafkamina. Nafkamina is what would be if you have a suffix Treifa. That's the nafkamina. If you have an animal, you have a suffix right now, whether it's a Treifa, so you're not sure. Is it a nekev or is it not a nekev? We'll see there's many shahilas, right? Kosher versus glot kosher. That's literally exhibit A. But you have shilas. Is this a treifa or is it not a treifa? Say the Rishonim is a very good eitzah. You know what you could do? Being that we paskin treifa in a chaya, let it sit around for Yud Beis Chodesh and let's see what happens at the end of 12 months. If it can live 12 months, be yadua that it wasn't a treifa. If it cannot live 12 months, then we know that it was a treifa. So you can't use the Yud Beis Chodesh test for a vadai treifa, because a vadai treifa is a treifa. That's a mitzias. The Chachamim said that if something is a treifa, halacha l'moshe misinai, it's automatically going to be aser. The fact that it can live more than Yud Beis Chodesh would mean more that nishtana hateva than anything else. And we don't care about nishtana hateva. We care about what was in the times of Moshe Rabbeinu. As the pasuk says, "Al pi atayra asher yerucha," like the Rambam brings. But we're at chapen afkamina as if you had a suffix treifa. If you hold treifa chaya, so you have a suffix treifa, you let it live more than Yud Beis Chodesh, so it doesn't mean anything because it could be it's a treifa. Aya lived more than Yud Beis Chodesh. A treifa is anyways chaya. How long would you have to wait? I don't know, but certainly not Yud Beis Chodesh. If you hold treifa in a chaya, so then there's a way to determine. You sit around for Yud Beis Chodesh, and again, this plays itself out in a lot of the controversial treifa shilas, because some of the treifa shilas that people make a big fuss over, it really is suffix treifa, and a lot of these animals live more than Yud Beis Chodesh. And being that we paskin that treifa einei chaya, if an animal can tough it out, Yud Beis Chodesh, that could be a raya based on what the Rishonim say to explain the nafkamina lahalacha, whether treifa chaya or treifa einei chaya. Either way, so we just had an important brisa. Tana devei Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael said the pasuk says bein hachaya anachelas ubein hachaya asher lo seyacha. What's it referring to? Elu shmoina esrei treifos shenemar l'moshe misina. And there's two important things in this brisa. Number one, Tana Rabbi Yishmael holds treifa chaya. What's the makar to the halachas of treifa? Hachaya asher lo seyacha. Chaya means the animal can live. So clearly, Tana Rabbi Yishmael holds that a treifa can live. Additionally, he gave us a list. He counted 18. Now the truth is, our Mishnah, if you were keeping score, also listed 18. The Mishnah didn't mention 18, but it listed 18. That's important. It says the Gemara, V'sulaka, are there only 18 treifas? V'ika baskar. You have baskar. Baskar is an acronym for 4 treifas. The beis, the samach, the gimel, and the resh stand for a specific type of defect, as we'll see. V'shev shmaitza. That's the other shev shmaitza. And this is the shev shmaitza, the 7 Amorok teachings that dealt with laws of treifa. In other words, it's not 18. It's 29, right? There's another 4, the Baskar, and then there's another 7. There's the Shev Shmaitz. So the Gemara says like this: Bishleima l'tana didan, Bishleima our Tana, who listed 18, but he never mentioned the number 18. So you could say the Tana, the 18 that he listed, or the Shire, and the 11 that he omitted. The Baskar and the Shev Shmaitza Asyu b'Zeh HaKlal. What was the last line of the Mishnah? Zeh HaKlal kol she'en kamoy chai treif. We know Zeh HaKlal is always coming to be marba something. So you know it's coming to be marba? Another 11. Okay, it's interesting. We mentioned 18, and then we have Zeh HaKlal that's marba another 11. But at the end of the day, it's not a kasha. You can't ask me a kasha, I'll tell you, a ton of a shire, or it's included in the Zeh HaKlal. A ton of Rabbi Shmuel, Da'ma Yud Ches Treifa. He mentioned a number. So once you have a number, you can't say ton of a shire. And he didn't say a Zeh HaKlal. So freak the Gemara, what happened to the Baskar and the Shev Shmaitza? So what are the Baskar and the Shev Shmaitza? What's the base? An animal whose leg was amputated above the joint. So there's a discussion. Does it mean the lower joint of the animal? You can refer to one of the pictures or the upper joint of the animal. But the point for now is that it lost its leg, minar kuva ulamaila, and the halach is treifa. So why did Tanit Rabbi Shmuel only have 18? Right? We're assuming that the 18 that Tanit Rabbi Shmuel has is the 18 that we mentioned in our Mishnah. So if that's the case, our Mishnah didn't mention the behemoth shenechtechu ragla minar kuva ulamaila. So how come he doesn't have that? So the Gemara says, Shimon Elazar, that holds that an animal that has this defect, you can cauterize the area where the leg was amputated, and the animal is going to be able to live. What's the Gemara's kasha? Who cares that it can live? The man, Kamar. Who are we going to try to explain the Bryce? Ton of Rabbi Shmuel. We said Ton of Rabbi Shmuel introduced two very important tenets in the laws of Treifus. Number one, Treifah Chai. Number two, the number 18. So l'chayra, if we're going according to Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Shmuel Treifah Chai is he holds Treifah Chai. So who cares that a behemoth shenechtechu raglam and arkuva lumayla yechayla lichvais v'lichyois? There's a way to do some sort of procedure that's going to allow the animal to live. At the end of the day, according to Tanit Rabbi Shmuel, if you hold treifa in a chaya, then this is checkmate. This is a raya that it's not a treifa. But according to Tanit Rabbi Shmuel, that's not a reason, not a factor for it not to be a treifa. So the Gemara says you're right. What we meant to say is that Tanit Rabbi Shmuel holds like a different Shimon Elazar. The Amak Sheiri, who said point blank, it's not a treifa. Bottom line is that the reason Tanit Rabbi Shmuel didn't list the bays of Baskar, the behemoth shenecht gur alam and arkuv l'mayla, is simply, practically, push it, because he holds it's not a treifa. How could he hold that? He holds like Shimon Elazar, who holds that it's not a treifa. The samach of chisaroin. This is the samach of Baskar. B'shedra. The time we learned to the Mishnah. Kami chisaroin b'shedra. The halacha is that a dead person is metama b'oil, but you don't need the entire corpse in the oil in order for the mace to give off tumma. But if you have certain bones, right minyan, right binyan, so one of the bones, that summais, that have an ability to be metama ba'oil is the shedra. However, the shedra has to be complete. If the shedra is missing some of its vertebrae, then the shedra does not have the ability to transmit tumma. So there's a Mishnah that addresses how much kama chisarim b'shedra does it have to be missing for it to lose its status as shedra, for it to be able to transmit tumas meis? B'Shammai says shtei chulyos, two vertebrae. And this is what we need. V'chein l'treifa. That the same machleis b'Shammai b'Hillel. You see from here that a spinal cord that's missing some of its vertebrae is not kind shedra. So if that's the case with regards to its ability to be metama tumas meis, it would make sense with regards to the laws of treifa as well. That means an animal that's missing some vertebrae would be considered a treifa. How much? Machleis b'Shammai b'Hillel. B'Shammai two choyos, Bissel one choyo. But the bottom line is you have another treifa. So how come Tanav Rabbi Shmuel didn't mention that if the shedra is missing some of its vertebrae, that too is considered a treifa? So the Gemara says an answer. Hem says ubeis hakoisais. In our Mishnah, that's the starting point. That's the 18. We assume that the 18 of Tanav Rabbi Shmuel is the 18 of our Mishnah. So says the Gemara, no, it's a false assumption. Our Mishnah had hem seis and beis hakoisais as two. The Rabbi Shmuel is chashvinu bechada. Hemseis and beis hakoisos with two of the four stomachs of the animal. And the Mishnah mentioned that if there's a nekev in the hemseis and if there's a nekev in the beis hakoisos, that each one is being considered a treifa, and it was considered two of the 18. Tani Rabbi Shmuel doesn't have it as two chashvinu bechada. As a result, he has one left over. So he's able to include the chisarim b'shedra. So the beis of Baskar, Tani Rabbi Shmuel disagreed with the other. Rabbi Shimon, it's not a treifa. The samach of Baskar, he incorporated in his 18. Where is it? If the 18 is the Mishnah, no, because the Mishnah has one as two, where Tana Rabbi Shmuel has it as one. Says the Gemara, you have the gimel of Baskar gluda. That's an animal that's missing all its skin. It was flayed. So this animal that doesn't have its skin, it's also considered treifa. So like Rameir, the Machshir, he holds like Rameir. Again, he doesn't hold the gimel as a treifa. There's a Rameir who holds that a gluda is not a treifa. He holds it's not a treifa. Va'ika charusa, says the Gemara, I have another one. I have a charusa, that's the reish of Baskar. So charusa is a shriveled lung. Now, Rashi says that really, the Gemara says later that a shriveled lung is not a treifa, but that's where it's shriveled one way. We're talking about where it's shriveled another way, so we'll have to wait for that. But the bottom line is what about the reish of charusa? What about this charusa? So the Gemara says, really, Tanav Rabbi Shmuel incorporated it. He's going to have to take out one of the 18 in the Mishnah. One of the things that mentioned in the Mishnah was if there's a hole in the gallbladder of the animal, a lot more about the gallbladder in tomorrow's stuff, but if there's a hole in the gallbladder of the animal, that would make it a treifa. Rabbi Shmuel held that that's really a das yochid. Man katani la Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda. He doesn't hold like Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda. Apik mara. He takes out mara v'ayil charusa and he adds charusa. So again, the kasha was 18. L'chari you have 4 more. You have baskar. So at the end of the day, what the Gemara said was 2 out of the 4 Rabbi Shmuel holds is not a treifa at all. He holds that a behemoth shenechtechu raglam and akuv l'mayil is not a treifa. Savalak Rabbi Shimon Elazar. He holds that the gluda is also not a treifa. Savala Karab Meir de Machsher. As it relates to the other 2, he incorporated the other 2. How did he incorporate the other 2? He took 1 out. He took out Mara, and 2 of the 18 that we had as 2 of the 18, he really has as 1 of the 18, the Hemses and the Beis HaKoises, those are 2 of the 4 stomachs. Thus, he has an extra one that he was able to stop in. Says the Gemara, what about the other 7, right? We had 2 kashas on Ton of Rabbi Shmuel. We had the Baskar, we had those 4, and then we have the Shev Shmaitza, we have the other 7. What about the Shev? So what were the Shev Shmaitza? So the Gemara is going to go through all 7. Rab Masna said, if the thigh bone gets dislocated, it's the ball of the thigh pops out of the hip, so the halacha is it's a treifa. V'amar rochish bar papa of Hadron fame. Mishmei the Rav, in the name of Rav, loksa b'chol yach, that's treifa. If one of the kidneys of the animal became sick, loksa is miloshin, diseased, so it became sick, the halacha is something wrong with it, it's like there's an illness of some sort, some kidney disease, it's a treifa. Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah, nitel hatchoil cheira, if the spleen of the animal was removed, it's kosher. Stating that, we need the next part. That's only if it was completely removed. Aval nikev, if there's a nekev treifos, that's the third. If the majority of the simanim, as in the simanim, the kana and the veshet, were nekar, they were moved out of place, the halach is it becomes a treifa. That's 4. A 5th one, nekret sela mi ikra treifa. If one of the ribs came out of place, it's considered treifa. And Rashi says that even though in the Mishnah we spoke about ribs, we said if most of the ribs broke, there's a difference between the ribs breaking and the ribs being nekar, being removed. If the ribs fall out of place, 1 rib can render it a treifa. If they break, you need the majority of the ribs. The majority of the skull of the animal was crushed. The last one, if the flesh that's covering the keres, if the majority of it was torn, that too would make it into a treifa. The bottom line is you have the Shev Shmaitza, these 7, they all come from Amayram. But why did Ton of Rabbi Shmuel not list those other 7? Says the Gemara, short answer. Nekuvi, if you count in the Mishnah, the Yud Ches, that's the starting point, the amount of treifas that are related to a nekev. There's a nekev in the veshet, there's a nekev in the reya, there's a nekev in the lave, there's a nekev here, nekev there. If you count up all the nekevs, you end up with 8. So in our Mishnah, it's 8, right? So the Gemara says, Chashvinu b'chad. He, Ton of Rabbi Shmuel, only had it as 1. If that's the case, how many treifas of the time of our Mishnah does Ton of Rabbi Shmuel have? His number is really 11. Because what our Tana had as 8, he only has as 1. Apik Shev. So he took out those 7 nekevs, right? That the Tana of our Mishnah had, and he removed them, V'ayil Shev, and entered the Shev Shmaitza. So we removed the 7 nekuvos, we replaced them with the Shev Shmaitza. At the end of the day, you end up with your number of 18. But the Gemara says, 2 kashas. Number 1, Ihachi, Oibazoi, Psuki Nami Trei Hava, Chashvinu Bechad. There were 2 that were mentioned in the Mishnah as nifsaka. So if that's the case, why are the 2 nifsakas mentioned as 2? They should be mentioned as 1 as well. What did nifsakas? Pseikas hagargeres. Number 1, if the kana was severed, that was 1. And the other one was nifsak hachuch, nishbara hashedr of nifsak hachuch. If the spinal cord was nifsak. So, Tanit Rabbi Shmuel took all the nekevs, even though they're 8, and he counted them as 1. And when it comes to the nifsakas, they're 2, he counted them as 2. Because if he counted them as 1, then your vayta going to be less. Then you're going to end up with 17. Another kash, one of the Shev Shmaitzes was a nekev. The spleen that has a hole in it, that was the 3rd of the 7, was also a nekev. Now, if you're not counting the nekevs, so that wouldn't be 1 either. So it wouldn't be Shev Shmaitza, it would be Shis Shmaitza, right? In Aramaic. It would be Shis Shmaitza. So again, you wouldn't
have a full 7. So l'chayra, if you're going to go ahead and you're going to take all the nekevs and you're going to make them into one, then really what you should end up with is 16. Because number one, if you're counting the nekevs as one, you should count the nifsakas as one as well. And number two, if you're counting the nekevs as one of the shev shmaitzes can't be counted. So we thought we were going to take out 7 and replace it with 7. You took out 7 and you replaced it with 6. So what you end up with is 16. So the Gemara has a geschmack teretz. What's the teretz? Elo hanach tarti da afkes loy tepuk. 2 of the baskar. The Gemara had 2 kashas. For ikar baskar, for ikar shev shmaitza. Had we answered the baskar, so 2 of them we said are really included, and the other 2 we say he doesn't know. Savalak Rav Shimon Elazar with regards to the base, Savalak Rav Meir with regards to the gimel. So we assume that the only way to make this Yud Ches work is by excluding and having those 2 on the outside looking in. But you know what? If we end up stuck and we need to add 2, Adarabba, let's bring those 2 back. We'll put them into our list. We have the base, we have the gimel, we have the whole baskar. As a result, you end up with the same number. You end up with 18. Just one last Gemara. Amar Ula. Ula said, Ches mine treifes never lo Moshe Messian. There's really 8 different types of treifes that was said to Moshe Rabbeinu. Nekuva. And he gave you a higher level list in terms of how this works. Nekuva, there are those treifes that are related to nekevs. We saw it, it's a long list of nekevs. Upsuka, some are based on something that was severed. Netula, sometimes an animal could be a treife because something was removed. V'chasura, or something is missing. Krua, something is torn. Jerusa, it was clawed. That's the ubasu basal, the treife lo yisachelu. That's the textbook example. Nevula, or something fell. Shvura, something broke. Why did Ula say this? Lafuke lakusa de rachesh bar papa. Because he didn't mention if an animal has a disease, it's suffering from an illness of some sort, that would ever make it a treifa. And rachesh bar papa had one hechetimsa, where an animal can be a treifa, despite the fact that it's not nekuva, psuka, netula, chasura, krua, jerusa, nefula, shvura. How is that? If it's a lakusa, and he didn't mention lakusa, so obviously you see lafuke the rachesh bapap amar chia barav not rav amar chia barav ches treifes eish benekuva. There are 8 different types of treifes benekuva. If you do the math, in Toimar says the Gemara test. No, it's not true. If you count it, really you're going to have 9. So the Gemara says one of the 9 is mara. And it's only a das yachid. The time you learned to the Brayse, nikva hakeva, nikvu hadakna. If there's a nekev in the keva, that's the 4th stomach. Nikva hadakna, there's a hole in the intestines. Trefer, af nikva amar. The point is, it's only a das yachid, and from there the Gemara is going to segue into Maro's daf, which is going to discuss the shita of Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, an animal that has a hole, a nekev mashu in its gallbladder, whether or not it renders it a trefa.